Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the General Epistles. This is our introduction to that series. The General Epistles are made up of Hebrews and James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st and 2nd, 3rd John, and finally the book of Jude. Now, what makes them general, and why do we, of course, they're epistles, we get that, but why do we call them the General Epistles? The question really here is of authorship. You see, the other epistles that we have in the New Testament are all written by Paul. And so we have what we could call the Pauline epistles, and then we could, I guess, call these others the non-Pauline epistles, although when we get to Hebrews, we're actually going to have a question mark. Now, Paul's epistles, you start off with Romans and 1st and 2nd Corinthians and Galatians. They deal with the subjects of salvation, especially in Romans, and the Christian life. Of course, salvation is seen both in Romans and in Galatians, but also the Christian life. Then we have what we call the prison epistles, because they were written while Paul was in prison, and they are comprised of Ephesians and Philippians and Colossians. There may have been some other books that he also wrote in prison, but these are the ones we refer to as the prison epistles. They have lots of calm reflection, as you might imagine somebody having who's in prison. Next are two epistles that I refer to as the eschatological epistles, and that's just a big word meaning epistles talking about the future things. And these are 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. They talk about the coming of the Lord in the future and how that relates to how we're living right now. And then finally we have the pastoral epistles, referred to as such, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, because they are written, I guess you could call them young pastors or young church leaders. But then also Philemon is sort of a pastoral sort of letter. Paul, as pastor, is writing to Philemon, one of the people that he knows, and it's about a personal, not entirely personal, it's really more of a pastoral issue that he's writing him about. If you're more interested in those, just go see my PowerPoints and my videos on the what do you call it, the Old, New Testament survey. What we want to look at, notice these are Paul's epistles, but then when we look at the general epistles, we see some of those categories repeated. For example, Hebrews is going to be largely about salvation, about seeing how Jesus is better than the Old Testament priests or the Old Testament law or the Old Testament covenant or the Old Testament temple, and he provides something better. So it's all about holding on to Jesus. And then we have James that talks about faith and works, how if we have real faith, then works are going to follow. So we could call that just talking about the Christian life. We have 1st Peter that is a book about suffering. In fact, if there's a counterpart to 1st Peter, I like to think that it's Job, the Old Testament book of Job. 2nd Peter takes us again in that eschatological direction, speaking about future things, especially 2nd Peter chapter 3, but it's not limited to that. And then finally, 1st and 2nd, 3rd John, and also Jude speak about the Christian life. And so we have many of the same categories, but now they're given for a different audience. So we have the Pauline epistles versus the general epistles. The Pauline epistles are largely Gentile in audience. Not saying there are no Jewish people to whom he's writing, but it's mostly Gentile. The polar opposite is true when we look at the general epistles. They are largely a Jewish audience. That's not to say there are no Gentiles there. But, for example, the book of Hebrews is called that because it's written to Hebrews. It's written to Jewish people. And James and 1st Peter also have a distinctly Jewish flavor to them. It's not saying there are no Gentiles there, although in the case of James, I think that really might be the case. But it's largely going to be a Jewish audience with all of these books. And it will sound like a Jewish audience as you hear the voice of the author speaking to them. Now, we need to understand that right at the outset, because there's a difference between what we could call Gentile thinking versus Jewish thinking. What is the difference between these two? The Gentiles think, and also Westerners, we tend to think in concrete terms, in very rational. Give me a series of rational points along the way. Very linear thinking, where you go from point 1 to point 2, to point 3, all in a very careful order. It moves from point to point in a carefully organized manner, and that's Gentile thinking. When I come to Jewish thinking, and I'm talking about ancient Jewish, modern Jewish people hang around Gentiles maybe quite a bit, but ancient Jewish thinking was much more symbolic. It was much more visual in its method of description. It was much more holistic, seeing the issues as a whole rather than seeing them linear and going from point 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. So that it would move in a journey through a series of thoughts, and sometimes it appears to be almost circular to our way of thinking, but it's really not. Instead, it's seeing the whole issue as a holistic way of looking at things. So that the Greeks would, and Paul says this, how the Greeks search after wisdom, but the Jews instead want a sign. And we see that is a measure of the differences between these two. An example of this is seen in 1 Samuel, the way we look at actually 1 Samuel chapter 17. Remember, this is the story of David and Goliath, and we read beginning in verse 4 that a champion came out from the armies of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span, and he had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was clothed with scale armor, which weighed 5,000 shekels of bronze. The passage goes on to say, verse 6, he also had bronze greaves on his legs and a bronze javelin slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the head of his spear weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield bearer, his shield carrier also walked before him. And we read that in our Gentile way of thinking, in our Western way of thinking. We say, okay, it's so many shekels. Gee, how much is a shekel? And I pull out my calculator, and I figured that up in pounds or in kilograms or whatever sort of measurement I'm using. The Jewish way of thinking would be a bit different than that. The Jewish way of thinking might look at that fact of he was 6 cubits and now 600 shekels. And we see that 6 and then another 6. And it reminds me a little bit of a place where the Bible talks about 666 being a picture of the enemy of God. And then remember that his in the previous verse that his armor was described as having scales. And you say, well, scales, what does that sound like? And we think, well, gee, that's the kind of armor they were wearing in the 1200s when this is taking, around the 1000s when this is taking place. And we equate it to the different things that we know from history, and the Jewish reader might be saying, scales. That reminds me a little bit about a promise that God had made regarding a serpent and the seed of the woman back in Genesis chapter 3. And sure enough, remember how Goliath is killed. He's killed with a blow to the head. That reminds me of that promise. And we don't read the scriptures that way, but the Jewish audience would. And so what we find in the General Epistles, it's written to that kind of audience. Now, the first century world was a world that had a number of different people groups in it. The ones that we're going to be looking at are the Roman, the Greek, and the Jewish worlds. I'm going to call them actually worlds. Because if you looked at a map, and again, I'm doing this from a sort of Western perspective, because I'm a Westerner after all, I noticed that the Jewish world, although there were Jewish people all over the ancient world, but mostly they were contained in the Middle East, the place of Canaan, or Israel it was called at that time. And then I had the Greek world, of course. There were Greeks everywhere that you see on the map. In fact, the Greek language had become the regular language. It was sort of the language everybody spoke. If you wanted to communicate to people of other cultures, you learned Greek. But the Greek world was mostly there. It was mostly the Aegean world. And the people in charge were neither the Jewish people or the Greek people, but rather the Romans, far to the west, at least for them. On our map, it's far to the west. And so you have these 3 different worlds that are all interacting, and they're very different. Now, the other thing that we see in the New Testament, you'd had the temple back in the Old Testament, but in those 400 years after the close of the Old Testament and before the beginning of the New Testament, something new had developed, and that was the synagogue. And so you have the temple and the synagogue. The temple was the place where you went to worship God. That was the place where the sacrifices were made. That's the place where God was supposed to show up. Now, whether he did or not, that's a question. He certainly had in the Old Testament. He had shown up when they built the tabernacle. The glory of God had come and filled the tabernacle. And when they had built Solomon's temple, the glory of the Lord had come and filled the temple. But now not so much. But there was something else that in the dispersion of the Jewish people, there was now something called the synagogue. And the synagogue, there was only one temple, but there were many, many synagogues. In fact, in any city where there were at least 10 Jewish men, you could have a synagogue. And sure enough, there were synagogues all over the Roman world. So that there were synagogues in Jerusalem and in Galilee and in other cities like Thessaloniki or Rome or all over the world. You would find synagogues, places where the Jewish people would come to read the scriptures, to pray, to do Bible study, and it was a place where you didn't have to travel all the way to Jerusalem to offer a sacrifice. You didn't do sacrifices in the synagogue. It was a place, a gathering place, a coming together place. That's what the word synagogue means. And initially we're going to see, in fact we'll see this in the book of James, where James will refer to the gathering of the church as a synagogue. Now the other change that had happened since the end of the Old Testament, where the scriptures had been written in Hebrew, is that now those same scriptures had been translated into the common language that was known throughout the ancient world. It had been translated into Greek. That translation was known and has become known to us as the Septuagint, from the tradition that 70 Jewish scholars were supposedly involved in making that translation, and so it was called the Greek 70. The way you say that in Latin is Septuagint. And so you had the Hebrew scriptures, but it could now be read by Gentiles. Of course, all of these copies were handwritten, so there weren't a lot of them floating around. It wasn't something that you could just go to your local bookstore and buy a copy of the scriptures, even a copy in Greek. Now, the other thing that we're going to see in the general epistles are the persecutions, and in particular, we're going to see the Jewish persecutions. The reasons for these Jewish persecutions, first of all, they looked at Christianity and what the Christians were saying about Jesus, and they thought, that's blasphemy. And in fact, I would say that if Jesus is not who he said he was, then what they were saying about him would be blasphemy. He described himself in terms of being the Son of God, and his followers echoed that, and his followers said he's the Messiah, the Son of God. In fact, they described him in terms that would properly only be used of God himself, which speaks to who he really is. But the Jewish people, and I'm not saying all Jewish people, because the early church was largely Jewish. In fact, they had a council to decide whether or not they should let Gentiles in. But they did eventually. But the Jewish leaders saw this as blasphemous, and the idea of a crucified Messiah was not something that they could really come to terms with, and so they saw the cross as a stumbling block. There was also some jealousy because early Christianity very early on began to become very popular, and so there was some jealousy on the part of the Jewish leaders for that popularity among the people. In Acts chapter 5, we read of a Rabbi Gamaliel who stands up in the Jewish Sanhedrin and says, maybe we ought to think twice before we try to persecute these Christians. It might be that they're from God, and we might find ourselves fighting against God. And they listened to him respectfully, but they didn't really listen to what he had to say, and they didn't really follow his advice. So that the Jewish persecutions, though, were initially limited to Judea and the surrounding areas. We had Saul of Tarsus, for example. It was one of those early persecutors until he meets Jesus. And these Jewish persecutions were Jewish in nature. That is to say that the Romans were not persecuting Christianity at this early date. Acts chapter 8, verse 1 talks about the stoning of Stephen and how on that day a great persecution began against the church in Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria except the apostles. And so with those persecutions, you begin to have you begin to have Christianity spread out. Initially forced out by persecutions, but then it begins to really spread and take root. And when it does, it begins to come in contact with Gentiles and adopt a Gentile flavor. Now, capital punishment against the Christians was initially unauthorized by Rome. That didn't mean it didn't take place. I just mentioned the martyrdom of Stephen. Stephen was put to death by Jewish leaders, by Jewish people. Of course, he was Jewish himself. But that was not something that Rome had authorized. It was actually an illegal action and could have been punished if it had been reported to the authorities. Of course, the authorities were sort of far away, and they weren't really interested in what one Jewish person did to another Jewish person. We have found an inscription. It's a curse on the Nazarenes that was added to official Jewish prayers of the late 1st century, and that's rather striking. That they would take that sort of notice of this early form of Christianity, which they referred to as the cult or the teaching of the Nazarenes. It's also noteworthy that early church historians talk about how Christians left Judea and moved to the city of Pella on the east side of the Jordan River just prior to the fall of Jerusalem. It may well be that they remembered some of the teachings that Jesus had given, some of the warnings he had given, that Jerusalem would fall, and when you see it surrounded, get out of town. And they saw what they perceived to be signs, and the story goes that they actually left both Jerusalem and Judea, so that when the Romans came against Jerusalem and finally took the city in 70 AD, the Christians had all left the building. It was just a few years before the fall of Jerusalem that Roman persecutions against Christianity began in the early 60s AD. And it began at the hands of the Roman Emperor Nero, and both Peter and Paul, the apostles, were both put to death, and that persecution now began to take its hand against the Christians. This was brought about because of a conflict of culture. You see, the Romans viewed themselves as religiously tolerant, but they could not be tolerant when faced with Christianity's exclusive claims, because Christianity claimed that Jesus was king, that he was Lord of all, and the Romans wanted Caesar to be Lord of all. You can't have two lords, and this would bring them ultimately into conflict until only one Lord would remain standing.